Good afternoon. I'm Chris Steinmetz from the Autism Society of Iowa, and I would like to welcome you to our third installment of five lunch and learns that we are offering throughout April. A couple of things just to remember, we are recording this, and the recording link will be sent to all of those who are registered. It will probably be sent tomorrow. And also, if you have questions, please add them in the chat room, and the speaker will address the questions at the end of his talk. Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jacob Michelson. Dr. Jake Michelson is a Roy J. Carver Associate Professor in Psychiatry and Neuroscience and the Division Director of Computational and Molecular Psychiatry at the University of Iowa. His lab uses advanced computational approaches to study the effect of genetic variations on the development of the brain, with specific applications in autism and language impairment. He earned his BS and MS in biological engineering at Utah State University before earning his PhD in computational biology at the TU Dresden in Germany in 2010. After his time in Germany, he joined the lab of psychiatric geneticist Jonathan Sabot at UC San Diego, where he completed his postdoctoral training and published several of the earliest papers dealing with whole genome sequencing in autism. In 2013, he joined the faculty of the University of Iowa, and his current research is supported by NIMH, NIDCD, the Simons Foundation, and the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. We are also pleased to say that Jake is also one of our board members for the Autism Society, where he contributes a lot. So we welcome you today, Dr. Michelson, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris, so much. And I like what you added at the end there because of the, numerous affiliations that one acquires as a faculty member. I think one of the most meaningful for me is to be on the board of the Autism Society. I think it's great to rub shoulders with so many great people and who are really invested. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and present some of the research that we've been doing in connection with Spark. And I'm thrilled to be able to present it to you. And I hope that we have a good and productive discussion afterwards. I should also say that if you have I don't have anything against people asking questions in the middle of a talk. Sometimes it works even better that way. So if you have a burning question that relates directly to something I have up on my slides, then feel free to chime in. I'll try and answer them. It's kind of hard to switch back and forth between slides and things that pop up in the chat. So I hope you understand if I don't happen to see it. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about a large study that we did about sleep and autism. And as many of the people who are on the call probably know, sleep is a major issue in autism, and poor sleep is a major exacerbating factor in autism, meaning that it can take underlying symptoms and make them much worse for everybody to deal with. First and foremost, the person with autism and also the caregivers and other household members. So whenever I talk about autism, I like to start with this slide because I think it does a good job of underscoring the huge amount of diversity that exists within autism, not just racial and ethnic diversity, but also diversity in age, diversity in sex, diversity in clinical presentation, diversity in talents and skills and strengths, and also diversity in the challenges that these individuals face. And so because there is a tremendous amount of diversity within autism, it's very difficult to learn anything meaningful about autism by only studying a handful of people with autism, just because there's so much diversity that is intrinsic in this trait. And so in recognition of that, 5 years ago, we're celebrating our 5th anniversary coming up, but 5 years ago, a massive study was launched called Spark. And it's more than a study. It's really, I think the best way to characterize it is a research community for autism, because it really is a community. And it's also a community that involves scientists and clinicians. And there are now over 250,000 participants. And the goal of Spark is to understand both the experiences, but also the biology of autism. And we hope that the more we know about these things, the more it will contribute to the improving of the lives and the situation of those with autism. So I want to emphasize that what I'm going to present today would not have been possible without Spark. This is really large scale research. It would have been impossible for my lab to do on our own. And because it's really important to have large studies to better understand autism, more and more autism researchers are going to Spark and recontacting participants in Spark and inviting them to be a part of specific studies like the one that you'll see today. And so I want to underscore the importance of, I think, going forward, if you have any passion at all about being involved in research about autism, then joining Spark is sort of the gateway to finding out about lots of other research studies that investigators across the US are in the middle of and are beginning. So you can join Spark, or you can just learn more about it by going to sparkforautism.org/U Iowa. And if you have an autism diagnosis or a family member has a diagnosis, then you or your family is eligible for Spark. You can, I'll talk a little bit about it at the end, a little bit more in detail. But I just also wanted to introduce you all. Probably many of you have met Kate and Sydney before, but these are our two project coordinators. And Lucas Casson, who's now a graduate student in the lab, he was the twice exceptional specialist, but he's now a graduate student in the genetics program. And so we work with all sorts of people, individuals, families, educators, advocates, providers, and other professionals to get the word out about Spark, to assist people in enrolling in it, even though, like I said, you don't need to go anywhere to enroll in Spark. You can enroll from your home. All you need is a computer or even a phone, and you can enroll in Spark, and all the study materials are sent to you at your home. So you don't need to go anywhere, which is especially valuable now that we're in the middle and hopefully tail end of a pandemic. And the final and arguably most important role that we play is that our team is a voice for science in the autism community, because there's a lot of dubious information out there. There's a lot of information that needs a lot of vetting, and so sometimes there can be some kind of pseudoscientific things that creep in. And so one of the important things that we do is that we are a voice for what is known through science about autism. So now getting in the direction of my talk, you all probably know, many of you from personal experience, that sleep is a major problem. More than half of the parents who are enrolled in Spark report that their child has problems with eating and sleeping. Now, I'm not going to talk about the eating today, but we collected information on eating actually in the same study that we did about sleep. I'm just going to talk about the sleep results, but we've also submitted a paper in the same sample on the eating challenges that one encounters in autism. So through Spark, we conducted the largest ever genetic investigation of sleep and eating problems. And today I'm just going to, like I said, I'm just going to talk about the sleep part of it. But if you are interested in the eating things, then let me know and keep an eye out, because it's likely that we'll have other talks and webinars like this covering that. So why is poor sleep a problem, other than the obvious that it's just kind of miserable to not get good sleep? Well, the brain is one of the most metabolically active organs in our bodies. And so in part because of that, it produces lots of waste. It's always working, and there are always byproducts of that working. And during sleep, the body has systems that are engaged that manage that waste buildup. And so if you have If sleep is interrupted, then those systems that normally engage are also interrupted, and that can throw off the metabolic and the functional and the physiological proper functioning of the brain. And so what that can do, if you have chronic poor sleep, it can exacerbate the underlying symptoms of autism, and you get kind of the snowball effect of less and less sleep making symptoms worse and worse. But even independent of autism, it raises disease risk all around. So there's risk of things for like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, depression, and obesity, just to name a few. So sleep is a problem, and because it's so prevalent in autism, it's something that deserves our attention, especially as researchers. So what we did is through Spark, we invited over 10,000 families with autism to participate in an online survey, and then over 5,000 Spark families participated in that survey. And the parents reported on the sleep habits of their dependent children, and they also reported on their own sleeping habits. I'm going to focus mostly on the sleeping habits of the children, but there's a lot of interesting work that's yet to be done by us on the relationship between sleep habits in parents and caregivers and sleep habits of the children. So our goal is to understand what the basic patterns of sleep disruption are, what might cause them, and what sleep aids work best in different kinds of disordered sleep. So I just wanted to, you don't have to read this whole slide, but I just want to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we asked these parents. And this is in particular about the children. And so just a few examples of whether or not the child needs the parent in the room to be able to fall asleep. We asked things like whether or not they sleep about the same amount of time each day, or whether that's highly variable. Other questions like whether they snort and gasp while sleeping, whether they have a hard time getting out of bed, and whether they fall asleep while they are involved in activities. Now, together, all of these form a picture of the kind of sleep or lack of sleep that a person gets, and what the differences might be between those different types. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to give you a broad overview of some very general statistics, and some of them are quite obvious, and they're just kind of sanity checks, things that we would expect to see, and we do. And others are beg some interesting questions. So first of all, on the left here in this panel B, apologize, I'm not sure why this turned out to be kind of a low resolution slide, but the CSHQ is that survey that we administered. And the total score is proportional to how bad your sleep is. So if you have a higher score, that's more disrupted sleep. Lower score is less disrupted sleep. And as you can see, even though the study was not longitudinal, meaning that we didn't ask the same people over time, we did have a fairly broad age range in our sample. And so one of the things that we can look at is just how the total sleep score varies with age. And we found that in general, in the older individuals, it tended to be lower, which I think is kind of intuitive for anybody that has children, that sleep problems tend to be most pronounced when they're young. In panel C here, this is the SCQ score, which is the Social Communication Questionnaire. And that is a survey that's administered to anybody who joins Spark can take that. And so there's a lot of data on that. And we happened to, we did not administer this, but it was just data that was available. And so we looked to see what the relationship was. And kind of intuitively, people who had poor sleep tended to report more severe autism symptoms, especially related to social communication. The RBSR, while the SCQ focuses on social communication, the RBSR focuses more on the other core symptom domain of autism, which is restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. And likewise, we found that individuals who had poor sleep also scored, had more severe scores on the RBSR, more intense, restricted, and repetitive behaviors. And then finally, in panel E there, the survey that we administered to the parents is an adult sleep survey called the PSQI. And likewise, a higher score there means more disrupted sleep. And what you can see is that if the child's sleep is disrupted, then quite probably the parent's sleep is disrupted. The interesting thing about this, and that I'm not going to present here, but that we want to understand better, is how much of that is an environmental effect and how much of that is a shared genetic effect, because obviously parents and children share genetic material, but they also share a similar environment in that it's not unreasonable to think that if a child is sleeping poorly and disrupting the sleep environment for the adult, then they are going to suffer the consequences of that, and that could show up in this score. But these are just the things that we observed that we need to parse out a little bit more. Again, the same on the y-axis here, again, is the sleep score for the children. And we did a couple of basic comparisons between multiplex and simplex families. Multiplex families are families that have multiple children with autism, and simplex families are families that just have one child with autism. And in the families that are multiplex, there's a slightly elevated, but it's statistically significant, slightly elevated sleep score in those families. Likewise, females have a slightly elevated score over males. It's statistically significant, but it's very, very subtle, as you can see here. If there's a comorbid ADHD diagnosis, those individuals have a higher sleep score, meaning more disrupted sleep, than individuals without an ADHD diagnosis, and the same thing for intellectual disability. Okay, now we want to move beyond the basic things, because I told you one of our goals is to understand the basic patterns of sleep disruption in autism. And so I borrowed this figure from a paper from several years ago that explored this idea of thinking of new ways to organize and group people in ways that are more meaningful and scientific with regard to, here it's talking about just mental illness in general, but you could broaden that to neurodevelopment and neuropsychiatric conditions. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, like I was saying at the very beginning, a lot of diversity, a lot of different kinds of autism. And so the idea is to collect information so that we can kind of figure out what the groups are, because we think that if we can figure out what the groups are and what the meaning behind those groups is, that we will be in a better position to think about what possible treatments might work for the specific symptom that we're thinking about. So here it would be sleep. And so on the right, you see this column of data-driven categories with little icons in different colors representing different groups that seem to be coherent in some way. And that's what we're going to try to do with our sample of over 5,000 families. We want to see if there are patterns in sleep and in how parents report on that sleep that we might use to organize our sample to figure out, are there differences between these groups, and might that suggest different biological mechanisms that relate to these different kinds of disordered sleep. And so I call that an archetype because we use a particular kind of analysis called archetypal analysis, where we're trying to find these clusters or archetypes of different kinds of sleep. So this is what the data look like. Here there were a few people fell out of our sample, but we ended up with close to 5,000 children, dependent children with autism. And across these rows, you see these different labels. So A2, and there's 8 in total. And A just means archetype. And I'll present to you in the next group of slides what exactly this means. But every column is an individual, and the depth of the shading here corresponds to how strongly they represent that pattern of sleep. So the darker, the more like that particular pattern they are. And so what we see here is that there's a chunk. First of all, there's kind of a big chunk here of what we call archetypal sleep. and that's 39% of our sample. And that means that this 40% of the sample were like a paragon of this kind of poor sleep. They fit into this exact pattern, and they didn't look like a mixture of a couple of different patterns, but they were like, the poster child for this particular kind of sleep pattern. And then the 60% that's not in that part, they're kind of the alternative, because they look like a mixture of a couple of these different types. So they're not like the pure form of this sleep disruption. So 40% of our sample archetypal sleep, and then of that, 50% of that have perfectly normal sleep. There's very little, if any, endorsement of any kind of sleep problems. So that's 50% of this archetypal sleep. And then the next on down, in the next few slides, I'm going to get into what these actually mean and what the patterns are. But you can see here that there's a breakdown ranging from around 3% in a fairly rare but common enough that we can detect it repeatedly among different individuals. So they range from about 3% up to about 50% of that 40% then. And then everybody else looks like a mixture of 2 or more of these 8 archetypes of sleep. So I'll just let that sink in for a minute. Basically, the main point is we're looking for recurrent and characteristic patterns of disrupted sleep that seem to kind of go together. And then we can use those basic patterns to describe everybody in our sample as some mixture of those. So the first one, again, is normal sleep. And this figure is going to stay here just for reference. But in all of the in the next several subsequent slides, I have some of the items that led to, that were associated with a person belonging to this particular archetype. So you can see here, these are all negative. So there's kind of negative endorsement of all of these problems. And that just means that sleep is uninterrupted and there don't seem to be any problems. So that's archetype 2, normal sleep. Then there's archetype 7, which is difficulty waking. And as you can see right here, there's a negative endorsement of that they wake by themselves. They, in other words, they need to be woken up. They wake up in a negative mood. They have a hard time getting out of bed. And there's a long time until they're alert. This is a type, and this is about 14% of the archetypal sleep. So this is one pattern. Then there's sleep anxiety, which these individuals score high on that they move bed at night. So in other words, they get out of their bed, they go to their parents' bed at some point in the night. They're afraid to sleep alone. They're afraid of the dark. They need the parent in the room to be able to fall asleep, and they often sleep with the parent in their bed. So that would be this type. There are about 13% of archetypal sleep falls in like squarely into this pattern. Then archetype 6 is restless or light sleeper. And the items that they endorse basically mean that they're kind of the opposite of the other one I showed you before, that they're an early riser. They don't ever sleep very deeply. They're kind of in and out of bed a lot. They're also afraid of the dark, and a lot of times they need a special object for sleep. But the main thread that kind of runs through all these is that they're a very tenuous sleeper. Then their archetype 1 is broadly affected, meaning that almost every item that a parent could have endorsed about bad sleep, they did in these individuals there. So we called it broadly affected because there was not a lot of specificity, but 6% of the archetypal sample falls into this broadly affected, where they are affected in multiple aspects of sleep. And then archetype 5 was sleep apnea and parasomnias. This has largely the defining characteristics here have to do with breathing. That there's a lot of snorting and gasping, and that they stop breathing periodically, or they snore really loudly, and things like grinding teeth and talking in their sleep are also endorsed to a lesser extent in there. But that was the characteristic pattern here. This is about 4% of the archetypal sleep group. Another archetype was archetype 4, high variability. And the things that characterize this archetype are that there's just, well, like it says in the name, there's a lot of variability. They may sleep 12 hours one day and they may sleep 4 the next. And it just kind of bounces around all the time. And the archetype is just characterized by a high degree of variability and lack of consistency. It's not, because you could imagine having problems, but that they are consistent problems. But with this archetype, there's just a lot of variability. I think this is the last one, archetype 8, which is daytime tiredness. And the most characteristic feature of this archetype is not necessarily that there's lots of sleeping problems at night. It's that whatever it is, it doesn't seem to be enough, because they, even during activities during the day, they'll fall asleep, or they're just generally very tired during the day, and that they have to take a nap. Those are kind of the more defining features here. I want to summarize all this because I promised a map, and probably the closest thing to a map is this figure here. It's called a simplex plot that shows all of the different archetypes, and then in the colored points and the filled points, those are individuals who display the archetypal pattern for that particular thing. And then everybody else who is an open circle is some mixture of these. And then again, to summarize, these are probably the most characteristic traits that relate to each of these. And across every row, you can see in red what the problems are. So again, normal sleep, there are hardly any problems. Difficulty waking, they don't wake themselves, and they wake in a poor mood, and so on and so forth. I won't go through all of them again. I will point out the broadly affected, again, you can see here is that there's just a lot of endorsement of these across the range. Most of the others tend to be fairly specific to a particular domain. So with this, we have kind of taken a first step of figuring out what the landscape of poor sleep and autism looks like, so that we can get beyond just saying, yeah, this person has poor sleep, but that we can move to a little bit more detail, a little bit more granularity, to think about what might underlie these various kinds of sleep issues. So yeah, again, there's the 8 sleep archetypes in about 5,000 families with autism. Everybody in the sample, we can represent them as some mixture of these 8 archetypes. So for the math heads out there, every individual in our sample has 8 coefficients, 8 values, that if that value is larger, then that means they are more like a particular archetype. So 40% of our sample are these pure archetypes, and then 60% are a mixture of 2 or more. So the next questions we have are, what can we learn about the genetic basis of these sleep archetypes, which we're just at the very beginning of, and so I want to calibrate your expectations. And then beyond that, what are the most effective treatments for each of these sleep archetypes? So if you attended the other ASA talk that I gave last week, then you'll have seen a very similar slide here. But I just want to introduce the idea of a tool that we use a lot in our work, and it's called polygenic risk. And it's not always a risk, because sometimes it's a polygenic estimate of something that might be good, like educational attainment is something that is highly heritable, and that if you calculate a polygenic score for that potential for educational attainment, that correlates with a lot of things. It's associated with a lot of things of interest. So you could think of it as a polygenic propensity score, but very often we just call it a polygenic risk score, or a PRS. And so looking at this karyotype that represents the whole genome here, we can ask questions, very general questions, like what effect do genes have on an individual's blank? And that blank could be a lot of things. It could be BMI, it could be or body mass index. It could be their height. It could be their potential for educational attainment. It could be their risk for schizophrenia. It could be their risk for heart failure, or a lot of things. But what that looks like in practice is that we basically have readings on lots of different places in the genome, and everywhere where we have a reading, anytime somebody publishes a study that is a genome-wide scan where they're looking for places in the genome that are associated with the trait, they publish what are called the summary statistics. And basically what that is, for every one of these places in the genome that's surveyed, they will give some estimate of how much risk there is for the trait. And it goes in either direction. It could be a protective thing against that trait, or it could be a risk factor. And so the idea, and so in green, if the protective factors were in green and the risk factors were in red here, you would basically just sum up across the whole genome a person's risk alleles or risk genes and the protective alleles or the protective genes. And then together you get one score out of that because you're summing them. And by itself, that score doesn't mean a lot. But if you look at what that score looks like across a large sample of individuals, you'll find that some people, for heart disease or whatever, were dealt a hand such that they have a lot of risk factors for heart disease and they add up. And likewise, there are other people who have a lot of protective factors. And so we use these polygenic scores that we can compute on everybody, and we computed polygenic scores for every person in our sample, for a variety of traits, which you'll see in the next slide. And then we basically said, does this score correlate with anything that we measured about sleep? And if it does, then what might that tell us about the biology behind these different kinds of disordered sleep? Now, there's a lot to take in here, and so I don't have very high expectations that you take in much, but I just want you to see the kinds of things that we work with behind the scenes as scientists. And so the rows you see here are the 8 archetypes that we discovered about sleep. And like I told you before, every one of these archetypes, for every individual in our sample, they have a score for that archetype. So everybody has a score for normal sleep. If you have a very high score for normal sleep, chances are that you do not belong to any of these other archetypes. But if you have a very low score for normal sleep, then chances are your scores are kind of distributed among one or more of these other archetypes. And so we see that normal sleep, again, higher is better, meaning that you would have a higher probability of normal sleep, is negatively associated with things like previous genetic studies of insomnia. So in other words, the people who have normal sleep have a lot of protective factors against insomnia. They have a lot of protective factors against having a high BMI. They have protective factors against risk for ADHD. They have EA is educational attainment. They have a lot of gene variants that predispose one to having high potential for educational attainment. And likewise, CP is cognitive performance. Interestingly, one of the things that was a little bit out of the trend is that they have slightly elevated risk for bipolar disorder. And then they tend to have more alleles for height, which is sort of a proxy for growth, and just generally, body growth. Now, you could go through every one of these other ones, every one of these other archetypes, and you could find genetic associations with these different kinds of polygenic scores that we calculated. So I'll just maybe pick one other one that is kind of interesting. The sleep anxiety down here, we found, let me see if I can find it in here. This was one of the very few that had additional psychiatric risk, right? So beyond just autism, the individuals who displayed a lot of this sleep anxiety type, that they need a lot of reassurances, that they tend to sleep in their parents' bed a lot, these individuals tended to show more genetic risk for other psychiatric conditions, as indicated here by this cross disorder. That means like any kind of psychiatric condition. SCZ is schizophrenia. And so there's this positive association here. Internalizing is kind of like a depressive type phenotype. And also ED is eating disorders, right? So there's kind of a chunk here that suggests that the sleep anxiety type seems to carry with it more risk for psychiatric conditions in general than some of these other sleep archetypes that might be even lower level. They might be more physiological. So that was kind of an interesting finding. So to recap here, the sleep archetypes that we discovered, those 8 archetypes, correlate in specific ways with genetic liability for both sleep traits that have been previously studied in the general population, but also with other things that we'll see down here. So some of the sleep archetypes, like the one that I pointed out, archetype 3, the sleep anxiety, show specific association with neuropsychiatric risk. In general, we found that polygenic estimates of body mass index, smoking status, and cognitive ability are also important in defining the nature of sleep problems in autism. So those were polygenic scores that we found to be repeatedly implicated in different kinds of disordered sleep. Now I'll get to the final part of my talk, which is on sleep aids. So we asked, not only did we ask a lot of questions about what kinds of sleep issues that both a parent and a child have, but we asked the parents about their child's use of different kinds of sleep aids and whether they were effective in improving sleep and whether there were any side effects experienced. And so the 5 classes that we specifically asked about were melatonin, because this is a very commonly taken one. We asked about antihistamines, PM variants, so like PM, Tylenol PM or Advil PM or these other kind of over-the-counter pain relievers that have additional substances in them that help with sleep. And then antidepressants, and then non-benzodiazepine drugs. So first of all, I just want to show you the breakdown of by each of these classes. We had they could answer that they're currently taking for sleep, that they're not currently taking for sleep, or that they have never taken that class. And as you can see, the melatonin by far has the most people currently taking it for sleep. And then there are also a lot of people who have taken it before but are not currently taking it for sleep. And then the next most common was an antihistamine and then an antidepressant, with very few people endorsing the PM variant or the non-benzo. So main takeaway from this is that melatonin and antihistamines are the most commonly taken to help with sleep. So I want to give you, one of the questions we had then was, does your archetype score have anything to do with whether or not you are likely to say that a certain kind of sleep aid helps? In other words, do the different forms of sleep aids have kind of a differential response depending on the nature of the sleep problem? And so we looked at each archetype, and we coded the responses in a 4-level way. So this deep kind of turquoise color is the best possible response because it means that the sleep aid works. So in this case, it's melatonin. Melatonin works, and they experience no side effects from it. That's the best possible outcome. The worst possible outcome is that melatonin doesn't do anything to help you sleep, and there are side effects. And then, of course, there are these other 2 levels in between where you respond, but there are some side effects, or you don't respond, but there's no side effects. So what we're seeing here along the bottom, this x-axis here, the archetype scores are all between 0 and 1, and 1 meaning that you exactly fit a certain archetype. So archetype here, archetype 1 is broadly affected. And we found that the closer you get to fitting into that broadly affected archetype, the probability that you will fall into this, least desirable group in terms of response increases a lot. Whereas the probability that you'll fall into the responder group diminishes as you escalate this score. So this would be, so archetype 1 would be an example of an archetype that does not seem to respond to melatonin. Now the opposite can be seen for some other archetypes. So we looked at archetype 3 here, which is again is the sleep anxiety one. The closer you get to fitting into this archetype as you ramp up the score, the probability of landing in this bottom group of non-responder with side effects, that goes down, and your probability of responding without side effects goes up. So we might say that there's evidence that at least this analysis supports the idea that if you fit into this archetype 3 of sleep anxiety, this is likely something that melatonin might help with, or that you have a higher probability than not of responding to melatonin. So we did this across all archetypes and all sleep aids, and the result is just summarized in this heat map here. So again, orange is bad. Orange means that you don't respond. This archetype does not respond to this drug. So basically, broadly affected did not respond to any of the things that we asked about, which I guess goes in line with the severity of what's described. And then normal sleep, for the occasional sleep problems that do happen for people with normal sleep, they basically said that almost anything works. Sleep anxiety, the only clear one was melatonin. For high variability, there was evidence that melatonin does not work at all, and really not a lot of strong evidence that anything else does. But it's interesting that in the cases where you have these archetypes where hardly anything works, there is a little bit of a sign that maybe an antidepressant would work, but there's so few people who have taken an antidepressant for sleep that it's hard to know. But there is stronger evidence if you are an archetype 6, the restless or light sleeper, that an antidepressant would work there, where there's not really any evidence that melatonin is effective. And yeah, and then the rest is just right here. So difficulty waking, melatonin seems to work there. And daytime tiredness, melatonin does not work, but antihistamines seem to work. So to recap this part of the talk, melatonin is readily available. It's basically just considered a supplement. It's well tolerated, and it shows the highest rates of response. But the thing to keep in mind is that depending on the kind of sleep disturbance that you experience, there may be little or no benefit to taking melatonin. Antihistamines may work well for those belonging to the daytime tiredness archetype, which is A8. PM variants may be effective for those fitting the sleep apnea or parasomnia archetype. Antidepressants seem to work well for those belonging to the restless or light sleeper archetype, and non-benzodiazepines showed less specific benefits. But again, that might be because we had very few people that said that they took one of those. But the thing I want to emphasize is that this was not a clinical trial. This was not, we were just asking people in sort of a retrospective way what their impressions were of these different sleep aids. So it's not a clinical trial, and you should always consult your doctor before changing anything about what you take to help improve sleep. But I just want to put that out there that more important than these specific conclusions, if you could even call them that, is that the general conclusion that different sleep aids will likely work depending on the type of disordered sleep that you have. That is the takeaway from this, that not we can't say to everybody, oh, melatonin should work, or oh, you should take an antihistamine. It depends on the kind of sleep, and this is something that we need to learn more about. So the overall conclusion before we open it up to questions is that just to recap, that we conducted the largest genetic study of disordered sleep in autism. And because this was such a large study, we were able to discover 8 sleep archetypes ranging from about 1.5 to 20% of the overall sample. And I just want to emphasize again that if we had attempted this same study in a sample of 100 people with autism, 100 families with autism, we would not have been able to get at the granularity of some of these less common sleep archetypes. So it's very important that we have these big studies. The other conclusion is that specific patterns of genetic risk for sleep problems, neuropsychiatric conditions, and other bodily, so like BMI or height, and cognitive traits define these sleep archetypes. The sleep archetypes respond differently to different kinds of sleep aids. And going forward, we want to see if these sleep archetypes can form the basis of more specific studies and interventions involving sleep. So I wanted to end the talk again with coming back to Spark. And if you haven't yet learned about Spark or joined Spark, and you or a family member have a diagnosis of autism, then please go to this URL to learn more and potentially sign up. Again, you can sign up in your home. What happens is that you create an account online, you invite family members, and then everybody gets these kits in the mail, a box with a tube in it that you spit in, you send it back, it's all paid for. And then the scientists like me will be able to look at the sequence of that DNA that you send back and of the information that you provide about the kind of autism that you experience. We can learn more about the relationship between those things. And step 4 is probably the most important, and that is that you can discover new research opportunities like this study on sleep that we did. We've done a number of other studies on gender identity through Spark, also on the eating problems. We've done studies on language. We've done studies on achievement in autism and creativity. So lots of different studies, and you become eligible for many of these simply by joining Spark. Some of the benefits are that you become part of the representation of what autism is. As scientists try to understand how the human brain works, you become part of that. And there's high quality resources like those at the /discover page. There's webinars all the time from world experts. There's up to $75 of initial compensation for participating. And there's the potential, and I want to underscore potential, of returning of genetic findings with genetic counseling at no cost to you. So currently about 10% of Spark participants receive a genetic finding. And that basically means if they find a certain kind of genetic variation in a gene that is unambiguously known to be associated with autism, then they will return that result to you with genetic counseling and at no cost to you. And like I said, there's the opportunity to participate in follow-up studies that are specifically relevant to your situation, like the study that I presented today. So with that, I wanted to thank Natalie Potschmidt, who is a former research assistant, and she's now in grad school studying to become a clinical psychologist. And she basically did all the work to gather this data. And Leo Brugman, who recently graduated from the lab, just defended his PhD last year, was the person who led the analytic effort on this sleep paper. Also like to thank the people from Spark and the Simons Foundation, and most importantly, the Spark individuals and families who made this research possible. So again, go to that URL /UIowa and check it out. Or if you've got other questions, you can check out our lab website and send me an email. But again, I'm happy to take your questions now. So let me go to the chat. Questions. So do you have any data comparing specific antidepressants with specific co-occurring conditions for A6 types? So unfortunately, no, because we, excuse me, let me just get a drink here. We don't have, so we have a free text place in the survey that people could fill in the specific kind of antidepressant that they were taking. what I presented today is kind of the first pass and the low-hanging fruit. We have not yet dug into the free text response, which is where people would have if they knew, they would have listed specifically the antidepressant that they were taking for. So that we might be able to get a little bit of extra mileage out of that, but we didn't have a standardized way, like check boxes, for instance, for all the different kinds of antidepressants that one takes for sleep. And so we didn't have people fill in information that way, unfortunately. Next person, Leah asks, if a child is adopted, is Spark still a useful option? Well, I will say unequivocally, you can definitely join. The So, I mean, the shortest answer is yes. It's still a useful option because you can still provide a lot of very useful information on the genetic causes, because obviously the child's DNA will be supplied. What's less informative is obviously if there's no biological relationship between the parent and the child, then that's one less analysis that we can do. However, just looking at the child's DNA and looking at the kind of autism that they have and how that presents can help us understand the relationship between specific kinds of gene variants and different presentations of autism. Is there an age cutoff to be part of the Spark study? That is an excellent question. And the answer is no. And that's why I think Spark is one of the coolest autism studies out there, because it is so inclusive. If you read in the literature, in the scientific literature, very often there's a lot of exclusionary criteria applied. People are just studying children, between the ages of 6 and 10 with autism or something like that, or younger children or whatever. But Spark kind of breaks through all those limitations. We have a lot of adults with autism who have joined, and they've been very helpful to us in particular with our studies of gender identity, because our first study in that has just looked at adults with autism and gender identity. And so we would not have been able to do that if adults were not joining Spark. And so we're grateful that they are. There's no age limit at all to joining Spark. Next question is very interesting on the melatonin usefulness. It helps answer why some families tell us it doesn't work and others are satisfied with results. That's absolutely true. And I can also kind of imagine the frustration of a family that hears about melatonin and people talk about it all the time, and it may be recommended to them by somebody for whom melatonin works very well, and it may be frustrating to hear from everybody that melatonin should be working, and it's clearly not in your situation, and that it maps back to biology, and unfortunately we don't have a totally clear picture of what all is involved in that, but from studies like this, we're starting to go in that direction of better understanding what the mechanisms, what the biological pathways are, so that we can, as progress is made and a lot of these results filter back to clinicians, that clinicians will be in a better position to say with some authority, the types of problems you're describing fit into this biotype or archetype or whatever you want to call it. And so because of that, we can pretty strongly or confidently recommend this option. And so that's part of what this study and other studies in this direction are trying to do, is just understanding that link between biology and presentation and outcomes and response to different sleep aids. So Allison says, I agree, Beth. A lot of people tell me it works well, but it has not worked for us. This was very interesting information. Thank you for doing this study. Thank you, Allison. Bernice says, thank you for the great information. 2 of my kiddos have autism, and I did use the melatonin for a while with my older child. I did not think it helped a lot, and now it makes better sense. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Jake, there's 2 questions that have come into me. The first one is, when more results come in from this study, are you willing to come back and share it with everyone?
Ooh, yeah, I'm glad that came up. That's a really good question. So I would like some feedback from you guys. Let me skip back up. One of the things that science let me just say to everybody, science takes forever. You have to be so patient because so much of it happens at a glacial pace. And I really appreciate the patience of participants in Spark and especially the ones that recognize that this all takes a long time. So one thing that we would like to do that will take some time, we'll have to get some approvals for, is we would like to generate a report for everybody who participated in this study, so that they would get back basically a PDF in their email or on their Spark dashboard that would basically describe the overall, in very simple terms, overall findings of the study. And then what would be value added for the individual is knowing where they fit in those different results. So for instance, one of the things we're looking at is to have this map of the different sleep archetypes. And then you could imagine you as an individual would be circled in like a bright red circle or somehow marked so that you know that is you in the midst of all of these other people with autism. And you're not alone in this archetype. A lot of other people, if it's a sleep anxiety one or whatever, a lot of other people are experiencing that too. And so that would be a part of this report that we're working on generating. But again, that takes time. It takes approvals. We actually don't know the individual identity of these participants. That's one of the things that greases the wheels a little bit, is that we don't have any identifying information. It's just everything's coded. So we have to work through an intermediary to get those results back. So it just takes time, and hopefully we'll be able to get that out sooner rather than later.
Jake, one more question before there's more questions in the chat room. If your child will not spit into the tube that you showed, are there other options?
Yeah, there are. The best option there, and we've done this a lot, and so I want to make sure that if this applies to you, you should not have any hesitation at all, because we have a sponge kit where it's a little bit more of an active collection. It's basically a sponge on a stick that you can insert in the mouth, and it just kind of sits there, and you can and it absorbs the saliva so that they don't have to spit. We do that through either an in-person visit, which I'll say that my research assistants have had the COVID vaccine, and so we're hoping to ramp up home visits more. We've had a bit of a hiatus right now, but we also have various other kinds of visits. We visit various clinics and other care facilities around the state. And so, but we will drive anywhere in Iowa to help out with saliva collection, especially if that involves somebody who can't spit into a tube like the one that was shown. So there are options. Don't let that be a barrier. Get in touch with us and we'll help you through the process.
Jake, there are more questions in the chat room.
Okay, yeah, I see. Are the materials available after the call is ended? So I'm not sure what materials specifically. I could put something together and have Chris send it out.
I'd be happy to do that.
Brittany, I don't know if can you elaborate on what specifically you would have been looking for? And then the PowerPoint. Okay. I might have to redact a few because this isn't published yet. And so what I will say is it's recorded. So Chris has recorded this. And obviously that's going to be sent out. Okay, great. So Marie says, I'd be curious to see studies for each of these archetypes that also look at herbal options like chamomile and valerian, et cetera, routines and other behavioral supports alone or in combinations with the medication side here. I think that's also a fantastic idea too, because there are a lot of, and frankly, there are a lot of non-medication or non-substance based interventions that you could think about. I was attending a conference a year or two ago, well, a couple of years ago actually, where it was fascinating. This person was an expert on sleep and autism, and she talked a lot just about the sleep hygiene issues and how much of an impact it can make when you have to pay attention to, the example she gave was quite vivid. But if you have a lot of things, just like if your kid is drinking sugary sodas before bedtime, if they are playing video games right up until the minute before they go to bed, if there are a lot of things that we can do that amount to sleep hygiene that can really make a big difference. And so I would be interested to see. Now, clearly not everything is going to work for every one of these archetypes, but I think what you're proposing, Marie, would be a great idea to look at all these different kinds of interventions and how they work in different kinds of archetypes.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, well, if not, I want to thank everybody for your
There is.
engagement and your feedback, and thanks for coming today and listening and hearing about our research. And please, if you haven't checked out Spark, go to the website and check it out.
Jake,
And
there is one more question.
oh yeah, what kinds of results have you seen with siblings as far as sleep? Do they seem to have similar patterns? That's a great question. And Aaron, we haven't done that yet, but likely we will be following up with a follow-up study on this. We'll kind of do all the things that we learned we should have done the first time around. This was kind of a pilot study. One of the things that we didn't do is we only asked about one child with autism. And so everybody only answered about one child, and we had a couple of different ways to figure out who that would be. Obviously, that doesn't get into the siblings that are there in Spark, both with and without autism. And so that would be something that we would revisit in the next round of this study. But that's an excellent point.
Well, thank you, Dr. Michelson. For those that have been attending each Thursday, next Thursday, we have Dr. Michael South, who will be talking about autism and depression. And the week after that, Dr. Michelson will be joining us again. And Jake, do you want to just give a little bit about what you will be speaking
just
on?
very briefly, that talk, we do a lot of research in collaboration with the Bell and Blank Center here at the University of Iowa. The Bell and Blank Center specializes in gifted and talented education, but more uniquely, they specialize in, they have a clinic for not just autism, but it's kind of a psychology clinic in general for individuals who are very high achievers, but who have some kind of either learning disorder or neurodevelopmental condition like autism. And so what the talk in 2 weeks is going to be about is how autism presents and some of the specific challenges that are faced by people who, on the one hand, have a very high IQ and are very high achievers, but they also have autism. And actually, it's very interesting. In some domains, these individuals are worse off than an individual who's in the normal IQ range and has autism. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about our research collaboration and hopefully some forward-looking things. Yeah. All right, Myra. Great.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Thank you, Dr. Michelson.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.